The difference between a selection test and a selection assessment is often lost in the industry. A lot of people use test and assessment interchangeably, and they talk about them as being really the exact same thing. And it's important to understand that there are some distinctions between the two and strong distinctions with what you can actually do with them. So when you think about a selection test, this really identifies the style of somebody. So we can identify their personality, we can identify their communication styles, what their preferences are in certain areas, and it's really individual to them. Whereas when we look at an actual selection assessment, we're identifying these same things, but the key is that we're identifying them compared to something. So it's all about comparing them to an industry norm or to a benchmark we've established, in your organization of what we know sort of breeds a really strong performer. So the test itself is a great tool to identify what someone might need when it comes to training and how someone might be on the job. And the assessment piece is really all about identifying what a candidate looks like compared to a norm and compared to, a standard of performance that we know to be really successful in an organization, in an industry, and, as granular down to on your team, if we can look at someone really who's strong and a strong performer. So the key is that both can be used, but making sure that we understand the distinction between the comparative nature of an assessment, whereas that sort of test is all about an individual and identifying what we can about them. The benefits of using selection assessments in the recruiting process really for me are sort of three-pronged. The first one, at its core, using a selection assessment can help you predict potential for on-the-job performance. And really that's what we're all trying to do in the recruitment process. Finding a way that's scientific, that's validated, that we can really understand, does this person have the potential to knock it out of the park when they join us? The second piece is that we can assess, proven, validated traits about somebody that we know are relevant to the role. So for example, in a sales assessment, we want to be measuring, can they prospect, can they close, and can we coach them to get better at these things? So we really want to make sure that we're using this assessment to measure things that are relevant and that are actually really important for on-the-job performance. And then the last piece is that we use a selection assessment as a way to almost validate what we feel about a candidate or challenge it. So research has shown time and again that, your gut feel in an interview is really only about 10 to 15% effective at predicting if someone can really do it. So the key is that the benefit of using this selection assessment will either say, yeah, your gut feels right, this person really can do it, or it'll challenge you and say, okay, maybe this person, showed you that they're extroverted or they're a good listener, but here are some cautions that we want to explore a little further to make sure that we're setting you up for success and setting the candidate up for success. At the end of the day, we really want to bring someone on who's going to fit and is going to do it. The most important things to consider when you're looking for a selection assessment really lie in, is this going to do what you need it to do in your process? So the first two pieces that get thrown a lot around in statistics are validity and reliability. All that means, is this test going to measure what you actually want it to measure on the job? And is it going to do it again and again and again? So is it going to do it in a reliable nature? So you want to make sure you're assessing actual skills that are relevant to what your candidates are going to be doing when they're on the job, and you want to make sure that it can measure it time and again. Those are the two first keys. The next piece that's so important is what people in the industry call validation. And the key there is that, does this assessment have the ability to be calibrated to your environment? So can the assessment be changed and adjusted so that we're really measuring the top performers in your organization? Because as we know, every organization is different, every role is different. So we want to make sure that what's behind the assessment can be changed and benchmarked to the people who are really doing the best job for you in that environment, so we can replicate that and go out there and find more people like that. And the last piece, which everyone knows, is return on investment. So the more you can really quantify the ROI of this assessment, the better off you'll be. So really making sure that, based on the work you're doing, based on the investment in this assessment, are you seeing a lift in productivity? Are you seeing a decrease in attrition? Are you seeing that dial moved in those numbers? And is it worth the investment you're making? And that's often something that sort of gets lost after, the investment's been made, it's been input into the process. We forget about looking at, is this really working? Is it really worth what we're putting into it? So making sure that the assessment has the ability to show you that is so, so, so critical. To determine the effectiveness of an assessment, it usually takes about a year. So the idea is that we can use the assessment, and in science we always say make sure you have a control group. So we look at the people who were hired without an assessment leading up to the implementation, and we look at how they're doing a year after. And then we look at the people who actually had the assessment as part of the process, and we look at how they're doing about a year later. And we always say a year. It can change based on the role, but a year is usually when the training has sort of finished, when the increased support from managers' teams has fallen off a bit. And that's when we really see sort of the DNA and the potential of somebody really kick in after that year mark. So we can look at them throughout that trajectory since they joined the organization and really identify if that group who was hired using the assessment, particularly those who are very strong on the assessment, what do they look like versus those who might not have come through with the assessment, to really get that ROI and see those lifts and what is really predictive of somebody who's a top performer.